Hello everyone, welcome to Roman Just Codes. I am Roman, and in the last episode, we explored the amazing world of Rive. Now, it's time to get your hands dirty and bring those animations to life in Flutter. In this episode, we will install the Rive Runtime for Flutter, integrate our first animation, and learn how to control it with code. Get ready to start adding some serious wow factors to your Flutter UIs. And remember, if you end up liking this video, please don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so that you can get more content about Flutter and Rive coming my way. Thank you so much for your support. And with that, let's get started. So let's go over the project that we're going to be tackling in this video series. This is going to be like a cool little application about a weird monster character called Mr. Bubbles. I don't even know why I named it like that. But what I'm actually capturing in this application is all the concepts that I'm going to be teaching throughout this video series are actually incorporated into this little application. So it's going to be a little character called Mr. Bubbles. You're going to be able to make them switch hats or do like a little jump dance or a wave. We're going to be using, again, state machines, animations, artboards, nested artboards, a bunch of those really cool concepts. You're going to have like a loading screen where you're going to be introduced to Mr. Bubbles. He's going to have like a little animation just looking at you and then just kind of pops up into the screen. Then after that, we're going to proceed to this page where you're going to be able to change the hat, change one particular hat out of those three options. You're also going to be able to make it jump, or you're going to make it wave while wearing one of those hats. Every single one of these items in here is going to be created using Rive. Although I've seen people who have created everything with Rive, this is an instance in which you're going to create some of those animated elements and then you're going to assemble it inside of Flutter by bringing some of those pieces together. And then you're going to bring it into Flutter and then you're going to animate them. You're going to trigger those animations. You're going to programmatically make them come alive, respond to an event, to a click event or something like that, create, perform an action after, let's say, receiving user input. And that is exactly what we're going to be doing. Also, we're going to add the capability that if you click on the top right corner, there's a little icon in there. If you select that icon, you can change the name of that character. In this case, you enter the name that you desire, you click save name, and then that updated name shows at the top. We're calling it Mr. Bubbles now, but you could call it anything you want after that, because we're going to be able to do text support, changing text within a Rive animation from Flutter, and that's something that I want to show you. But every other element that you see here has been created with Rive, and that's exactly what we're going to be doing. The buttons were created with Rive. The whole character was created with Rive. The hats were created with Rive. But for example, the background, how I assembled them was created in Flutter. The Mr. Bubbles and the Bubbles animation, that was created with Rive. But then I brought it inside of Flutter and then I animated it a little bit. So you see how I told you that you bring some of those pieces together. You combine Flutter animations and Rive animations to actually create really, really powerful Flutter applications that pop, that sizzle, and delight your users. And then that's it. So we're going to be creating this. So now let's go back to the editor. We're going to leverage some of that knowledge that we picked up from video 1, and we're going to implement those now. Every single one of these things, like I said, is going to be created in the editor. We're going to start with a very basic animation, and this button right here is going to have this jump button. It's going to have an internal animation of a little ball bouncing up and down. Then we're going to proceed and create this little wave animation. So it's going to be just the hand just waving side by side. So we're going to start small and then we're going to work our way up. So those are the two animations that we're going to be creating initially. Then we're going to come back to Flutter, install the Rive Runtime. We're going to install our first animation and see how they're displaying in our screen. So we want to start seeing them be painted on our screen. So we're going to start with those two animations. Let's jump back onto the editor. I'll see you over there. And then now we're going to start creating our very first animation with Rive and Flutter. I hope you guys are as excited as I am, because we're going to now create our first animation. So in the first video, we went over the Rive editor. We studied how to create an artboard, how to bring elements into it, how to create basic shapes, how to manipulate those shapes, how to change the properties of those shapes. So we went really basic on that. And remember, you're not going to learn everything in the first swoop. That's why I left some of the other features for some of the upcoming videos. So you're going to learn those, and we're going to do a little bit of discoverability. That way it's not like so daunting and so overwhelming for you. So we're going to be learning some of those as we go. Okay. So the next step now, we're going to create our first animation while we also create some of the initial assets for this application. Okay, so why don't we do that and we're gonna clear our stage. I'm gonna just get rid of everything that I have in here. I'm gonna even delete all of the artboards, and we're gonna start from scratch. So our stage is blank, is empty, and we're gonna create our first artboard for the application, for the animations that we're going to be creating. So let's start with a artboard 500 by 500, just the way that it is. And I'm going to click where it says create artboard, and immediately you see that an artboard gets created, right? So we have this surface, which is 500 by 500, is gray, it doesn't have a name. So why don't we add a name to it? Let's call this artboard jump animation. Remember, there are multiple ways you can change the name of your artboard. You can select the artboard. Remember, the selected artboard shows that little dot before the name. You can even rename it here by double clicking on the name. Just type jump animation and it also reflects there. So that is the way that you name your animation. I want my artboard to not have a background. So you remember, you select the artboard, you go to the right hand side, and there's this area that says fills and strokes. So you're going to remove, either hide or remove the fill. In this case, I'm going to remove it completely. That way I don't accidentally turn it back on or something. So I'm just going to remove it. It's going to be a transparent artboard. Okay, so that's exactly what we're going to do. So now next thing, let's add two basic elements, two basic shapes inside of our artboard. We're going to go to the create tools. And we're going to drop we're going to click on the drop down. We're going to select one ellipse. Remember how to create an ellipse proportional on both width and height. So you press shift. So I'm going to select ellipse. Before I even start dragging, I press shift and then I start dragging. And then you see how my ellipse now gets created in there. So now what I'm going to do is I can just position it, move it a little. By the way, I'm actually going to change my design background because I want to see a little more. So I'm going to just bring it a little lighter. That way I can bring a little bit of contrast between. There you go. So something like that. That way I know where my artboard sits and where it ends in relation to the stage behind it. So now I see that I have this element. Remember to always be guided by Rive while you drag your element, your basic shape, either using the arrows to move it left and right. You can also try to scale it. Remember, you can scale it on the y-axis or you can scale it on the x-axis. I always encourage, unless you really need to do that, yeah, you could do it like that. But I would encourage you to use either the elements right here or use the trick that I showed you. If you do shift and then you hold shift and then you drag it, you scale it proportionally. For example, you can just do alt shift. And for example, you can do, remember I told you can do shift and you see how you can scale proportionally, but it starts from the opposite corner from where you're dragging. But if you want it to stay right in the center, in that position of where it is, you can just hit alt shift and then you grab one of the corners and then it remains in the center while it is keeping the same aspect ratio, is keeping the same proportions, but it is actually scaling proportionally on all ends. So if you see there, that way I'm changing, you see I'm changing the size as I do this, but the scale, scale remains at 100%, but the position and the size changes. You see, if I do then scaling, if I want to scale, I'd rather do it like this, and then I can change only one while the other just remains in sync. So that is the difference between if you want to scale proportionally, if you want to scale while remains in the center, if you want to change the size and the width or the scale, you could do it like that. So I'm gonna, again, change the size. I can just scale it down. If you see, I'm actually changing the size while the scale remains at 100%. So if you see, I'm actually changing the size, I can just bring it a little lower, and then I can let myself be guided by Rive while I change this position. So I'm going to keep it at the top right here, but I want it to be vertically positioned at the top, but centered horizontally, but leaving some space below because I'm going to add another element there as well. Now with my ellipse position at the top, now I'm going to add another element. Let's try to add a rectangle. So I'm going to go here, go to the create tools, click on rectangle. And just like before, I can hit shift to create a perfect rectangle. But then for example, I want to size it. I don't want to scale it. I want to change the width, but still retaining the height. So the way that you do it is just grab it from one of the ends and then just, you see how the position changes, how the size changes. It still keeps the anchor in the center, but it's actually changing the width of the element without scaling it. I just want to change the dimension. Now I can even drag it around and just make sure that I position it horizontally in regards to the circle, but also position it at a distance, let's say from the bottom of the stage, at a distance from the bottom of the artboard. That way, because again, you're kind of inferring what I'm going to do. I'm going to do like a bouncing animation. So these are the two elements that are going to be involved in my animation. So now let's change maybe some color of this. Remember, you know also how to change the color. You can select one element, you go to the right hand side, and right here in the fills and strokes, you can change the color by just selecting it and then finding an appropriate color for that. So the color, I'm gonna pick it right from here from the Figma. So if you see here, if I select the color, I'll probably just pick it using like the color picker, right? So you can do this, and I'll pick like that green. So it's that green right there. I'm gonna pick it. So I'll grab that color. But again, you can create your own creation. You can follow along with this. I can also share, of course, I'm going to be sharing some of these assets on not only on GitHub, but we're going to be sharing the code, the whole project, and the community file with which this project was created. But I'm going to start picking some of the colors from here, from the design. I'm going to copy that color. And some of the colors that you're going to see me bringing over is because I'm going to be picking them from there. So I'm going to make these two elements green, just like in the design. So I'm just going to copy paste the color. I select the element, go to fills and strokes, and then I'm just going to change the color in there. You could use the color picker right here if you want to. I wanted to just grab the exact color that I have on my design. Let me change this temporarily. I'm going to change the fills and strokes temporarily just so that I can see the element come to life. So remember, we're going to start with that little bouncing animation. That is exactly what we're going to do here. So with my elements in place, I have my ellipse, I have my rectangle. Now I'm going to make this bounce up and down. How do we do that? Now we're in the design mode. Now let's switch to the animate mode of the editor. All you need to do is click on animate, and now you see how other things pop up. So when I switch from design, you see how everything is just more design oriented. And now when I click on animate, now things switch to animation. And here you see this animations panel on the lower left side of your screen, where you have a state machine and you have one timeline. Here you have a panel called inputs. We're going to be discussing inputs much later in the series. Listeners also is going to be amazing, so please stay tuned. We're going to be discussing some of those too. But you're going to focus mostly on this element right here on the bottom center. So in a nutshell, state machines are the visual way to connect animations together and define the logic that drives those transitions. They allow you to build very interactive motion graphics that are ready to be implemented in your product, in your app, in your game, or in your website. And state machines, as you see there, they create a whole new level of collaboration between your designers and developers, allowing both teams to iterate deep in the development process without the need for a complicated handoff. In this case, your designer creates all the assets, they create all the inputs, all the listeners, all the interactions, all the animations and whatnot, and they just hand it off to the developer, and the developer just needs to trigger some of those things, flip things on and off, programmatically trigger those animations and whatnot. So a basic state machine consists of a graph, and again, we'll explore each of these pieces and more throughout this video series, but the graph is the space in which you will be adding states and connecting those transitions. Again, it appears in the place of the timeline when a state machine is selected in the animations first. So you see I select a state machine, you see how there's this item called entry. This is how a state machine starts kind of like bootstrapping or executing. These are the transitions or the connections between one animation and another. This is just the entry of the state machine, and then there is a unidirectional flow from the entry to an animation, also from one animation to another animation, and so on and so forth. We're going to be creating some of those transitions. So here, if you select a timeline instead, for example, if you select the timeline here on the animations panel, you select the state machine, you see the graph. This is how you see the whole composition of all the animations. But if you select the timeline, now the timeline is what gives you this view right here. The Rive interface displays a timeline with this playback controls and options for the current animation in animate mode. So you're in the animate mode, you see the timeline. You will see, for example, the list of animations on the left of the, right here on the left of the timeline, you see all the animations. Right now there's only one, and that animation is called timeline. There are 3 types of animations. Right here, it could give you a one-shot type of animation, meaning starts from the beginning to the end, and then it stops at the end, and it doesn't do anything. So the loop is exactly what it means. It just goes on a loop. It just plays continuously, infinitely as a loop from the start to the end, and then back to the beginning, to the end, on a continuous infinite loop. And then last but not least, you have the ping pong. So ping pong is kind of like the playhead continuously plays from the start point to the end, but then from the end goes back to the beginning, and then from the beginning back to the end in a ping pong fashion. Not like loop. Loops go like this, and then like this, and then like this. But ping pong goes beginning, end, begin, end, begin, like that. Just go back and forth, as opposed to the loop, right? And then the one shot, remember, it just goes, plays from the beginning all the way to the end, and then it stops, and then that's it. Here is the playback mechanism. Like here, if you hit play, it just played it, remember, from the beginning to the end just once. There's nothing in here in the timeline. We're gonna be adding things in there. If you switch it to loop, look how the playback little needle goes. So it just goes in a loop. If I switch it back to ping pong, look how the ping pong does. So ping pong is exactly what I described. It just goes to the beginning to the end, from the beginning to the end, back and forth endlessly. If you pause it, then you can see that. And this is how you change here the duration of your animation. For example, here the current tells you where the playhead is. In this particular way, the playhead, if I put it on 30 frames, you will see how the current says 30. That means 30 at 30 frames within a second, because a Rive runs at 60 frames per second. Here, for example, it tells you how it snaps keys at 60 frames per second. So if you place the playhead right here at the 30 frame mark, when you select the current, you will see that it's at the 30 frame mark. The duration tells you the whole duration of the animation as a whole. I can change it from 1 second. You see, like I can move the playhead from 0 to 1 like that. I can change then the duration to, let's say 3. I'm gonna make it 3 seconds. And then if I just bring it over, you see how now it's at 3 seconds, and my playhead is all the way at 3, and then I can just switch it back and forth. Playback speed, it tells you how fast you want to execute that animation. In this particular case, 1x means it's just going to be normal 3-second duration. But even within this 3-second duration, you can just say play it at twice the speed, and by doing that, and if you run it, it's actually going to be played at 1.5 seconds as opposed to 3, so it's going to be much faster. So that is when you want to change the playback speed. So I can just change the playback speed back to 1. This is the snap keys is the interval at which keys can be placed on the timeline, and by default keys can be set at a subdivision of 60 for each second. In this particular case, I just leave it like that by default. So that is the timeline. Now we want to change, for example, how we perform this animation. So the way that you perform animations in Rive is actually by placing keys and changing and setting keys. So objects and their properties appear on the timeline once they have been keyed. So you have to key elements. There are many different ways in which you can key a property of one given element. For example, you can manipulate an object directly on the stage, again, that you could do right there within the artboard, right? By changing any transform, like its position, its rotation, its scale. And then once you populate that, or you can change the property manually on the field. For example, if I select this item, look, I select the ellipse, and you see how the timeline doesn't have any keys, but now I'm gonna manipulate the position key. So you can do it in multiple ways. You can manipulate the item directly on the artboard. For example, I'm gonna manipulate the position on the y-axis. All I need to do is just move it on the y-axis, and you see how automatically there was a key placed on the timeline. I'm gonna do it again. If you select the ellipse, you see there's nothing in the position of the Y. There's nothing in the timeline. But if I start changing the Y position of that element while in animate mode, and then I drag it down, you see how the Y property in the position on the right hand side panel actually got keyed, and you see that it shows in blue, and here also it shows as a little playhead item, as a little key within the timeline. This is saying that at time 0, that ellipse is going to be at 166.5 on the y-axis. For example, I can change it back again. And what I'm saying here is I am actually keying the y position of that ellipse at time 0. If now I say at time 3, I want the position, the y-axis of the ellipse to be all the way at the bottom, I just drag it over, and you see how at the 3-second mark, there was another key added automatically, and it shows the position, the y position of that ellipsis will be at 316. So if you see position 0, look, it's already doing it. So at position 0, it will be at 119, the position. So you key that property. And then now, if you drag it over all the way to the 3-second mark, you see that the y position was keyed at 316. Now I can play it as a one-shot animation. Look at this. If I just spray play, it's going to last 3 seconds from time 0, position 166, I believe. Yeah, oh no, 316. If I double click on that key, it's 119. So at time 0, position 119 on the y-axis. Then at time 3 seconds, position y 316. And then all you need to do is now execute that animation, and Rive, what it does is interpolates all the values in between and just performs the animation as if I was actually moving the ellipse. And then what it just did is kind of like interpolated those values in between. And then I didn't have to move it myself. All I need to do is just dictate what the initial position is, and then I'll dictate what the end position is. And that way you have your first animation. If you see, it's just a very simple ball just going up and down and then remaining there. If I want to switch it back to loop, look what loop does. So within 3 seconds, it's going to go down, but then it's going to start right back up again. And then it's going to continue going down, and it's going to do it infinitely. I'm going to change the time back to 1. But look at this. If you do 1 while the key was still in 3, you're going to lose that. So you need to make sure that when you do that, make sure that, let's say, if you do this, you either need to key it again, otherwise you're going to lose it, just like I did right now. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to change it back to 1, but I'm going to key that end position back to the bottom, just like this. Now I have my animation just executing within 1 second time frame. Now let's say if I do the ping pong one, which is I wanted to show you the third one. So you see how now our little circle is moving from the position 119 at time 0 and then position 316 at time 1. So if I go back over at position 316 at time 1. So you see Rive already took care of animating the pieces in between. All I need to do is just dictate the beginning and the end. If you want to go more intricate, if you want to go more specific, you could actually key each element in between, but why do that? Because Rive is already doing that. Another cool features that the timeline has, you can select the whole timeline and you can change, for example, the curve, the interpolation curve in which it executes. For example, if you do linear is just going to be just one linear execution, right? Just a flat animation just going from one point to another point with no easing or anything. If I just do this, change the interpolation, I select all my keys in the timeline and I select now the hold. Look what hold does. If I bring my, let's say if I bring my key over here and then I do up, down, and then I do another up, for example, if I bring it up like this again, look what it does. So if I do this, it does kind of like that, up and down, but it's doing the hold, meaning it's not going to interpolate the values in between. It's just going to render whatever you dictated on each one of those keys. So I'm going to bring it back the way it was. And I'm going to show you one of the ones that I use a lot, which is this one right here, which is the cubic interpolation curve. So if I select that, look how smooth the animation is compared to the linear one. So this is pretty much the one that you're going to gravitate to mostly, like doing this type of animation. You just move it up and down and you use the interpolation curve for your animations because you have that nice easing curve to that animation. Then you have other ones where you can truly manipulate like the Bezier curve. You can like truly go crazy, go nuts on that. The Rive team added this additional elastic curve, which is pretty cool. If you just select it and you do elastic, look, it does that like elastic behavior, that elastic effect on your animation. I like to keep it simple. I like to either do linear or this one, the cubic curve, and then it's actually gonna cover most of your bases if you do this one. So back again here on the left hand side, you have your state machine. It is also encouraged to change the name of your state machine. In my particular case, because I'm using also these state machines in Flutter, I like to name my state machine the same name as the artboard. So in my case, I'm going to copy jump animation, and that is exactly the same name that I'm going to put on my state machine. So remember, I mentioned that state machines are the visual way to connect animations together. So the state machine covers you see the graph, and this is how you see all the connections. The timeline is then the animation that when you have one artboard selected, you see all your animations right here on the animations panel. Here, the timeline shows timeline 1, but I think I would call it more appropriate. I could say, for example, I can call it bounce. Now my animation is called bounce. The state machine that controls my bounce animation is called jump animation. Entry just means, again, it's just, this is how you're going to enter the state machine. The state machine just goes inside. These connectors right here are what dictate how you reach that next animation in line within your animation graph. If you just delete that transition in between, look, I'm just going to delete it. And if you run, nothing happens. Why? Because your state machine, even though it has those animations floating in there, there's no connection to it. There's no way to reach that animation. So the way that you use transitions. Transitions, how do you create transitions? I'm going to pause this. How do you create transitions? All you need to do is just hover over the source of that transition, and then you see that little circle appearing. You drag a line to your desired animation, in this particular case, bounce. And then now what this does is, as soon as the state machine kicks in, your entry is going to give you, is going to allow entry into this state machine. And the first thing that is going to execute is bounce. This transition right here, if you select it, is actually governed by certain conditions. Right now, there's no condition to get into this animation. When you select that transition, there's nothing impeding you from getting to the bounce animation. And that's pretty cool. What this means is, once you start executing the state machine, just go right ahead and start executing the bounce animation. Look, you just go like that, and then it starts bouncing right away. But what if you want to block it? Later, we're going to get to that point, like how you, based on a given condition, whether a property is true or false, whether you trigger an action, whether there was, let's say, a numerical value associated with your condition, then you can enter that transition. We're going to get into conditions a little bit later. For now, let's just assume that as soon as you start your state machine, you can execute your animations. For now, this state machine has only one animation and one animation only. Let's just keep it simple. Later, we were going to get into more animations and whatnot. So if you see, if I pause my state machine, nothing is playing. I am in animate mode. I can switch back to design. Everything goes away. But if I switch back to animate, everything is there just as I left it. There's my state machine called jump animation, and then it's showing me the graph by default. And then if I select some of the timelines or animations under my state machine, then you can see them there. For example, like the bounce animation, which is a ping pong animation of a ball just going up and down. Simple as that. Awesome. Let's go back to the state machine. And if you see here, the state machine is composed of that graph that shows transitions going into animations. I don't know if I showed you, but you could actually delete an existing animation or an existing transition. You can delete the transition or you can delete the animation, but this is non-destructive because you could just bring it right back and connect it again, and then it's all good and fine. But sometimes whenever you have maybe a lot of conditions, you want to preserve the state of your graph the way that it is. So try to not fat finger and delete like your animations and whatnot, because sometimes it's a little bit of a hard work to do that. Make sure that you have your state machine with all the connections and all the transitions into your animations the way that you desire. We're going to get later into what exit is and any state. At a minimum, you can just think that any state means you can start an animation from any given state. You don't have to just provide one single point of entry into your animation workflow. Here, any state can just trigger any animation. An exit is just that state in which you can have your state machine. When your animation finishes, you want it to be on the exit state, and then you can use it for any purposes that you want. But in this particular case, we just want to keep it simple. Now that I've covered some of those things, let's continue manipulating manipulating our timeline to make it a little bit more like looking like a bouncing ball. So remember that whenever you key properties, those properties get keyed in the timeline. Let's say whenever you start, the ball just starts as a full circle, and then whenever you drag the playhead and you reach the destination, which is at the bottom, I want that ball to actually look like it's a little bit squished. So give it a little bit of a realistic, like bouncing look. So at this position, what I want to do is I want to continue manipulating this animation and make it look like it's actually bouncing. So notice that at time 0, I've actually keyed the Y position. Now what I want to do is as the ball moves and it's a full circle, I want it to look like it's squishing when it hits the ground, like it squishes a little bit, like it's made out of rubber or full of air, and then it just bounces right back up. So the way that you do it, you could do this. Like I selected the time 0, you see that I've keyed the Y position. I also want to change the size. Like right now it's 117. You just want to keep it like that. And then now when I reach the bottom, like maybe it hits the floor or something like that, if I select that, I want to key the height as well. But in this particular case, I want to shrink the height a little bit. And now you see that when I bring it back to the beginning, the key that I specified here on my ellipse on the Y position is still 119. The height is 117. And you see how, notice the value. Look, as I move from one point to another, it starts shrinking. It starts like squishing, just like if it was a real ball. And then now if I bring it like this, it kind of looks like it's bouncing or like squishing. You want to make it a little bit more realistic, of course. I'm not like this amazing animator, but I would assume that probably maybe the bouncing starts when you hit the ball as opposed to like right in the air. So what we're going to do is we're going to manipulate the positioning of this ellipse when it reaches the bottom and then when it becomes squished. So this is the animation that you want to perform. So I'm going to do this again. Instead of keying the height, I'm going to keep it again at 117, just like it was, but I'm going to do this. I'm going to bring it back to where it should be. There it is. But I want to make it so that it hits the floor a little bit before. So I'm going to drag this a little bit before, probably at the 45 or like a 50 frame mark, at the 50 frame mark, right? And then now, while it's hitting the floor, then I want it to squish. So from this point, I want it to be, I want to change the height. It's still 117. So from this point, I want the 1 second mark to then be the version where it's actually bouncing or squishing or like compressing. That way it looks like this. It hits the ground, then it starts shrinking like that. Then it goes right back up like this. You see? Maybe what I could do is instead of letting it hit the floor completely, I want it to maybe still be in the air a little bit before I start doing that. And then look at this now. It looks a little bit kind of like the way that I want it. Maybe let's bring it back again. Or instead, what I could do is make this a little bit smaller, like that transition, that bouncing effect, maybe want it to be smaller. If I change it back to, for example, like a linear animation, now it even looks like a little bit better. Like the bottom part looks really cool, right? Awesome. So that's exactly what I want to do. But maybe I want to change back again to my curve because I want it to be smooth when it comes down, and then it does that little bouncing, right? And then it just goes right back up. So why don't we can just keep it like that, but at least I just wanted to show you again the basics of the timeline, how you key properties of your element along the timeline from one point to another point, from one starting time to an end time. Rive also takes care of interpolating the values in between, so you don't have to key those elements individually. I showed you how to start and stop those animations, how you can change animations from one shot. For example, in this particular case, this is a one shot to a loop. Let's say if you want to do like a loop, or you want to do ping pong. Ping pong is the one more appropriate for this type of animation. So this is kind of like what I want. Let's just keep it like that. The time, remember, we did current meaning you see where the current playhead is. You can just drag it along the timeline and then you get the current playhead. The duration is the whole duration of the animation. In this particular case is 1 second. Playback speed is just one time 1 second, meaning that this is the speed at 100%, let's say its value. For example, if I just change it to 2, look what happens. So it looks a little bit quicker, still retaining the 1 second duration time. But if you just want to change the speed of the whole playback, then you can do it just like that. I'm going to change it back to 1x, and then there it is. And now you can just play it back exactly the way that it was. Remember that you can flip from design to animate. Whenever you're in the animate, you look at the animations panel, you get your state machine. The state machine is that visual way to connect animations together and define the logic that drives those transitions. Here you have transitions that take you from one point to the other, in this case the entry of the state machine into the first animation, which is called bounce. You can rename your animations, but in this case I just called it bounce. You can remove the connection and then nothing happens, or you can reconnect them again and then you see then the animation executing. Later we're going to go into more complex animations, but at least I just wanted to create your initial animation, and then that way you can bring it into Flutter, and let's see if this is actually working out the way that we want it. The artboard is still called jump animation. It is just a circle bouncing up and down, simple as that. I'm going to pause it. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to select my artboard and I'm going to remove the background or the fill so that it remains a transparent artboard, so that when I bring it inside of Flutter, I can just overlay it on top of anything that I want. Okay, so now with that animation created, let's go to one additional topic that I haven't covered, which is how do I take this animation from here into Flutter? So what we're going to do now in Flutter is we're going to start installing the runtime. We're going to be prepping our Flutter application in which we're going to be bringing all of these animations. We're going to import our first Rive file, and then we're going to launch this animation. We're going to show it on a screen, very simple. Okay, so why don't we proceed with that? So the way that you get your animation outside of Rive and into Flutter is by exporting your animation as a .riv file. .riv file is the format in which you can export your animations from Rive, and then you can import it into any platform that you want to consume your animation. So let's try it in Rive. So the two ways that you can export your animation or this particular file as one Rive file is by exporting the file. You can click right here at the top right corner where it says export, and you click here where it says export. Then all you need to find is just a place where you can download that file. In my particular case, I want to rename my file before I export it. I'm going to change it again, Hello World Rive, or just Hello Rive. Let's just call it like that. When I export this file, Hello Rive is going to be exporting as a .riv file. If I just click and export, and then you see that now it's called Hello Rive. I'm going to have like a folder called assets somewhere, and then I'm just going to dump them in there. Then I'm going to bring them inside of my application. But for now, I'm going to export it as a .rive file. Look, I'm going to hit save, and now the file gets exported. You can also export it by going here to the hamburger menu, click export for runtime. And then if you click there, it's the same thing. You can overwrite it with the new version, but it's the same one. I'm just going to replace it. But those are the two ways you can just export your Rive file for consumption within Flutter. Remember that you have an artboard called jump animation, you have a state machine called jump animation, and you have an animation called bounce. This is critical. Why? Because we're going to access those programmatically from Flutter, and that is the way that we're going to reference those animations from inside our Rive file once we import it into our Flutter application. If we go to the folder where I downloaded my Rive file, look at the file size of that Rive file. It's 403 bytes. It is optimized for performance. It is optimized for size. It has a low memory footprint, and you see it's just 403 bytes, and it contains all of that inside. So it's amazing. Now we're going to grab this file and we're going to bring it into Flutter. We're going to be installing the runtime for the first time, and we're just going to see this first animation for the first time. And now you can be proud of saying, I created my first animation in Flutter. So why don't we do that right now? So we're going to leave the Rive editor for a little bit, and we're going to pop right into Visual Studio. And then right from here, I'm going to create a brand new project, Flutter, create hello Rive -- empty. So we're going to start with an empty Flutter project. Now I'm going to open right into it. And now right from inside of my project, the first thing that I'm going to do is install Rive. The way that you install Rive is you type Flutter pub add Rive. just like that. Let it install. So with my project created and Rive installed, the first thing that I like to do is create a folder within the assets folder, create an animations folder, and this is where I'm going to be dropping all my animation files. So the way that I like to do is I create a folder called assets, and right under assets, I call it animations. I go to the pubspec.yaml. Remember, you need to make sure to add your assets in there and mention that you have a folder called assets animations. Then this is where all your animations will reside. That's exactly the way that you want to keep it. Now let's find that animation file that we created earlier, which is called Hello Rive. So what I do is I just grab that RIV file, drop it inside of the animations folder. Then that is the first step right there. And then now, how do I reference this Rive file? I already installed the Rive package. Why don't I try to reference this file from a widget and then see if I can display that animation? I'm going to be launching the iOS simulator because we're going to be simulating building an iOS application. But remember, Rive works on iOS, Android, web, and all of those platforms. But for now, I'm going to be just testing it on an iOS simulator. Okay, my emulator is running. I'll just create a basic widget just to show that animation in there and just making sure that Rive is installed correctly, that my animation is displaying as I expect. So let me try to just launch this application at the beginning. Okay, so the hello world launches in my simulator. Now what I want to do is show that Rive animation that I created, the little bouncing ball. I want to show it at the center of the screen. So how do I do it? So I'm going to get rid of my text widget from here. And because I know that my Rive file is located in the assets folder, I'm going to reference it right from there. And I'm going to use the path to the assets animations folder, just like this, assets animations hello rive.rive. How do I use it? So the way that I do is because I already installed the Rive Runtime, I also have access to some of the widgets available as part of the runtime, and one of them is called Rive Animation.asset. By accessing this factory constructor, it allows me to invoke an animation that I have stored in my assets folder, and then the way that I invoke it is I just refer to the path as assets slash animations slash and then the name of the file hello rive.riv. And now I just save it and reload it. And now you see you were able to load your first animation created in Rive, brought it into Flutter with very minimal effort, and now you're able to start creating amazing experiences. As a recap, you saw I installed the Rive Runtime just by saying Flutter pub add Rive. I added a folder in the assets folder called animations. I made sure that the pubspec.yaml has a reference to that assets folder so that it knows where to locate my animation files. I brought my hello rive.rive animation file into that folder, and last but not least, I created a widget available as part of the Rive Runtime called Rive Animation.asset. You provide the path to where the asset is, and then that's it. Later in other videos, we will show you how to provide either a lot more parameters to here, for example. So just as a little spoiler, I can show you that here you can provide, for example, state machines. If you had more than one state machine in your file, you can invoke it. Remember, in our case, our state machine was called jump animation. If I still provide it in here, it will actually load that precise state machine, because if you don't provide it, it will just go for the default state machine on the default artboard. Remember, we had also one single artboard. Also, we called it jump animation. If I, for example, specify here artboard and then I say jump animation, this is not breaking because it is still the same animation. Because I didn't provide anything, Rive was smart enough to say, oh, I think you mean the default artboard, the one that is selected by default, or kind of like the first one that you have in here. And also I'm going to go for the first state machine or the available state machine that is in there. You see how it was very easy for us to create a very basic animation. You created it with very basic shapes. It was just a bouncing ball up and down. You were able to create it in Rive, export it out of Rive as a .riv file, you brought it into Flutter, and then magic happened. So now stay tuned for the next video where we're gonna dive right into creating our amazing project. Let's just bring it right over. So we're gonna dig right into this project. So now I think you're ready to start diving right into it, creating those shapes that are gonna bring our character to life. You're gonna be able to create all of these amazing assets right from the editor. You could also create them outside and bring them in. I'm also going to show you that. But just with this little bit of introduction that we just given you within these 2 videos, we were able to accomplish a lot. We've given you a very good foundation so that you can embark on more difficult stuff, on more complex stuff, and now we can give shape to this amazing project that we're putting together for you. So stay tuned, and I'll see you on the next video. Hey everyone, I'm Roman. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, please make sure to like and subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss out on other Flutter content coming my way. Thank you so much for your support. Also, don't forget to follow me on social media.